Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're having a good day. Thank you for being here. I know that many of you might have stayed awake last night watching the election results, and so we really appreciate that you are joining us, even if you're going through lack of sleep and even a little bit of a lack of hope. But we anticipate that today's presentation is going to be very insightful in terms also of peace building conversations and reconciliation initiatives. My name is Josefina Chavarria, and I'm the director of the Peace Accords Matrix at the Kroc Institute, and I am really delighted to welcome you all here, and especially our very special guest, Professor Roddy Brett. He's a professor for peace and conflict studies at the University of Bristol in the UK. And today we are going to talk about this wonderful new book, Center Peacemaking. So, Roddy was a Kroc Fellow here in the years 2023 to 2024. So a lot of the writing for this book happened here at the Institute. And so it is really wonderful to know we are the first audience also that has a presentation about this topic. And yeah, just thank you, Roddy. Welcome back to the Kroc Institute, where we're always happy to have you. Let me say a few words about Roddy's trajectory and background. His research focus include conflict resolution and peace building, transitional justice, political violence, forced disappearance, and genocide studies. As part of his research, he has examined how states, community, survivors, and international organizations respond in the wake of political violence, and how each of them shape their own processes of transitional justice in conflict-affected countries. He's not just a very good and very well-published professor in terms of academic research, but he's really one of those persons that embodies what an academic scholar practitioner is. He's been senior advisor to governments, as well as to the diplomatic community and human rights organizations. And he has over 13 years of experience working and living in Guatemala and Colombia. He has published an amazing amount of books. I had the privilege of reading an advanced copy of this book, and this is my favorite book so far. So I can tell you it's really an excellent presentation. So today's program will follow this, we've structured it along the following lines. First, Roddy is going to present his book, more going a little bit into the content, the main arguments, etc. For around 20 to 25 minutes. It's a lot of time, but not so much time after you've crossed the Atlantic and have been traveling for over 29 hours to get here. And then we will have Patrick McQuestion. He's a PhD candidate in peace studies and political science here at the Kroc Institute. And he will join the conversation by sharing his views for around 10 to 12 minutes. And afterwards, Professor Alison Rivero Meneses, she's a professor at the University of Warwick and a scholar residence here with us at the Kroc Institute and the Keough Norton Institute. She will also offer her comment for around 10 to 12 minutes. And then we will be more than happy to engage in a broader conversation with all of you. So without further ado, Roddy, welcome, and please share with us your presentation.
Thanks, Josefina. Thanks, everyone. Great to be here, even on such a not very auspicious day. And who'd have thought that Colombia would cheer us all up? Doesn't happen very often. Well, actually, that's not true. It probably does. Thank you, obviously, Josefina, to you, to the Peace Accords Matrix, Asha, to you, to Aaron, to Kroc. It's really great to be back, and also in the building I basically lived in for a year, around the corner. What better place to be on a day like today than with friends old and new to shake us all up and get a bit of hope, right? So I appreciate the fact you've all come out. It's really great to be here. So before you ask, there isn't any more room in my suitcase. There are already two people from the Kroc Institute who are coming back. It's complicated, but I suspect we'll talk more about that over wine. So I'm going to talk a little bit then about the book, of course, that Josefina has been describing, the majority of which was written here. And so all problems and issues, please direct them to the Kroc Institute. So it was thanks enormously to the Kroc Institute. I mean, it was really, the heart of the book was written here. Began it in 2015, really. The research for the book began in 2015 when I was directing an investigation for the United Nations in Colombia on the peace process, and specifically on the role of the victims delegations. So it was a decade pretty much of going through it, but really the heart has been written here. So it's wonderful to be able actually to come back and to feel I'm giving something back. So I'll just introduce a little bit the core themes, and then I'll talk about the Colombia case. I'll talk very briefly about the methodology. Maybe we can talk about that all in the Q&A, and I look forward to your comments. Patrick, thank you very much. And then I'll close with a few comments and conclusions. So just in terms of the war, I don't need to tell people at the Kroc Institute about Colombia's armed conflict. 5-decade-long armed conflict, of course, very diverse political actors, guerrillas, paramilitary organizations, of course, the state, drug trafficking organizations, and of course, it's a very internationalized conflict, or has been, that's brought with it levels of mass systematic violence, right? It's effectively an egregious human rights catastrophe, a frenzy of horror and a barrage of killing, maiming and carnage that's brought with it around 9 million victims. And of course, what we saw was very callous violence perpetrated by state and non-state actors alike. We know that very well. That was always, as usual, carried out in the name of state security, emancipation, liberty, and empowerment, and visited upon principally civilian victims, right? But what, in a sense, matches that carnage and horror has been the extraordinary mobilization of survivors and victims in Colombia since at least the 1980s. And really very recently, over the last 2 decades, they've become really significantly important political actors, human rights organizations, victims organizations, women's organizations, peasant organizations, and so on. And what we've seen as a result of these mobilizations has been really important episodic and innovative survivor-led peacemaking and peace building that I go into a lot in the book that's embedded within the wider conflict itself. So in a sense, as much about being a book about war and the effects of war on human beings, this book is about how survivors of atrocious violence narrate and make sense of violent conflict and assert their agency in the hope of building peace. So it's kind of a bit of both. So in terms of the key themes, the book focuses then on the peace process, the recent Santos-FARC peace process, 2012 to 2016, and really asks the broad question of whether or not inclusion matters. And in that regard, what I'm talking about is the inclusion specifically from 2014 onwards, although there was a series of precedents to it, from 2014 onwards of victims of political violence in the negotiations themselves, right? So probably a lot of us know that 60 victims were invited to Havana, where the peace process was taking place, by the negotiating parties to present their testimonies and their proposals for one specific peace agreement, point 5, the Transitional Justice Agreement. So the book is very much about that, but it also speaks to kind of wider questions, as Josefina was saying, related to transitional justice and, of course, to peace building and peacemaking. 2 of which I'll mention now. First of all, what I think is really important is the book evidences how transitional justice as a paradigm has evolved, right? And it's evolved in 2 really key ways. So first of all, it's become increasingly embedded in peacemaking and peace building. So the liberal peace project, if you like, on the one hand, moving away from being kind of linked directly to authoritarian and post-authoritarian regimes. And on the other hand, it's become moving gradually the paradigm of transitional justice towards becoming a very victim-centered mainstreaming approach. So in other words, bringing victims in. And that is a result of the fact that for decades, victims and survivors have rightfully criticized transitional justice mechanisms for not approaching and engaging with and listening to their concerns, their demands, their interests, and their experiences. So that's really what the book is about. And in a sense, I make the contention that the victims' delegations that we'll talk about in a moment are really a kind of context-specific manifestation of both the local turn in peace building and the victims' turn in transitional justice. So two turns, lots of turns in peace building. So the book then, starting with this question of whether or not inclusion matters, asks three questions in that regard, right? How, if at all, and to what effect can survivors of political violence actually participate meaningfully in this case, formal peacemaking processes, so in other words, in the peace process, and how can they, if at all, shape the accountability mechanisms that come out of that? So the mechanisms oriented towards justice, reparations, truth, and so on. And then I asked the question of the degree to which, or whether peace negotiations can actually be more inclusive of victims and survivors, and what might be expected from such a process, right? I think probably none of us, and I'll come to this in a minute, would oppose the fact of bringing victims in to make proposals to negotiating parties, but what can we expect in that respect, right? And then finally, so the victims delegations were really kind of mandated to come and to make proposals to the negotiating parties with respect to the content of the peace agreement, right? Which is the first two questions here, if you like. But actually, what they did really well, and I think very inadvertently, it wasn't planned, was develop spaces for encounter between victims and their perpetrators, right? Out of which a lot of really significant transformation took place, and I'll come to that in a moment. So those are the three sort of questions guiding it. I'm not going to go into detail in this, really happy to come back. I guess the first point to make is that because the research was initially carried out with a big patron for me, the United Nations, that sort of meant it was complicated, right? And it sort of meant there were certain things I couldn't ask, certain things I couldn't say. Happy to come back to that later on. But that sort of challenge also gave me really extraordinary access and privileged access to the victims' delegations, right? So as I've said, there are 60 individuals that go to Havana. I end up interviewing 52 of them, 2 or 3 hour interviews, really heavy interviews, really interesting. And then I also had around another 17 interviews or so with members of the government, the diplomatic community that was supporting the peace process. Santos, when he was here, spent a lot of time talking with him. The original sort of data was published by the UN in a report in 2017. But I was able actually, after that, to go back to Colombia and spend a lot of time carrying out sort of follow-up interviews with some of the folks who'd gone to Havana. So that also gave me the possibility of sort of allowing them to reflect upon sort of 2 years later, what was their experience like. But, really happy to come back to that in a minute. So this is what it looks like. In the end, there are 2 chapters on historical political history of the violence, the first 2 chapters. I then kind of look at how we got to Havana, how the victims got to Havana, and in a sense, the main argument there is there are sort of two elements. First of all, the fact that victims' mobilizations were so extraordinarily important in Colombia that, in effect, the negotiating parties had little choice but to bring the victims' delegations in, and that's linked, obviously, to wider normative changes at the global level. And also, actually, I sort of talk a lot about Santos as an important sort of innovative peacemaker who went kind of from pariah to an innovative sort of peacemaking president. And then I focus really, the heart of the book is on the interviews, right? So a lot of the stuff in these pages really is a direct relationship with the interviews. I cite a lot in there. The book was over 20,000 words more than it should have been, precisely because of that. But we didn't cut them out. My editor thought it was a good idea to leave them in, and I think it has been. So again, happy to speak about any of these issues in a moment. So I just wanted to ask the question of why inclusion matters, right? Why should we think about, contemplate bringing victims to a negotiating table, right? And in a way, there are 2 kind of key arguments, right? We know very well that historically peace negotiations were carried out between armed actors, But there's been a very important tendency over the last 30 years or so, really to start bringing more conflict-affected populations to the negotiations themselves. So there are two kind of key arguments. One, the obvious moral one, that if we're negotiating provisions for a post-accord settlement and polity, we need to bring in those people most affected by the violence into those negotiations, into those discussions, right? Probably not very controversial. The second one is a little bit more complicated and slightly dodgy, I think, although there are really key convincing aspects to it. What is it? So it's a more of an efficacy argument, if you like. So the argument goes that if you bring victims to the negotiating table, logically they're going to bring alternative perspectives, such as issues pertaining to sexual and gender-based violence, other questions that probably the negotiating parties ain't going to be focused on, right? Because they're thinking more about disarmament, they're thinking about amnesty and that sort of thing. And by so doing, what that would essentially precipitate are discussions that move, therefore, beyond those priorities of the parties and begin to identify unseen patterns of victimization. So, as I said, sexual and gender-based violence, violence against LGBTI plus populations, and so on. What does that do? Well, the argument then goes that if that happens, the next step is that you will eventually, at least potentially, get more representative provisions in your peace agreement. Okay, broader issues are dealt with, and that therefore, by bringing in local or subnational agendas and actors, you can also begin to generate wider legitimacy. That's where I think it begins to become problematic. I'm happy to come back to this in the Q&A, and that having wider legitimacy and a broader sort of negotiating agenda will foster broader societal appropriation of peace talks, and in this case of accountability mechanisms, thus strengthening the peace settlements and making them more resilient to recidivism and able to deliver a better quality peace. That's a lot, right? That's a lot of, I think, wishful thinking or thoughtful wishing. Again, happy to come back to that. Some of that did happen, and I'll come to that in a moment, but that's really the kind of main argument. But of course, the point is, a lot of scholars question all of that, and they say the efficacy of inclusion mechanisms is really questioned. That despite this kind of nominal focus on victims, victim-oriented transitional justice just isn't cutting the mustard, right? It's not borne out in empirical reality. Inclusion is ultimately rubber stamping, it's tokenistic, inclusion objectifies, disempowers, instrumentalizes victims, and very often just simply doesn't introduce or bring in or incorporate their demands that they make during the negotiating phase. And of course, the Colombia case kind of speaks to a lot of those questions. And in a sense, the last issue is, really, could we expect the inclusion of victims to make a peace settlement more resilient? That's a lot to ask. But again, really happy to hear people's comments and thoughts on that. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about the findings, really. So 2014, 5 delegations of 12 victims each go to Havana to present their testimonies, to present their proposals. They're given 15 minutes to talk each. Of course, they talk for much more than that, fortunately. What does that do? Well, I argue in the book that 2 things happen. On the one hand, victims play a really important role as peace builders. So in other words, they're able to effect very important relational change, and I'll explain a bit more about that now. And on the other hand, they also act as peacemakers. In other words, they begin to shape the actual content of the peace agreement, and I'll come to that subsequently. So bringing victims to the negotiating table in Havana 2 years into the peace process, 2 years during which the negotiations were taking place, not even in Colombia, but in Cuba. There was no need at all for the negotiating parties to look at, to speak with, to think about really their victims. And suddenly, for 5 months, one after the other, you have 5 delegations enforcing, right? Essentially bringing what Santos claimed was bringing the human face of suffering to the peace negotiators in Havana. And they effectively do that. And so what you begin to get is a really important space for victim-perpetrator dialogue and encounter. Now, 48 out of the 52 folks that I interviewed said that they came back from Havana with improved mental health and physical health. Nightmares had stopped, right? For them, it had been fundamental to be able to look their perpetrator in the eye, tell them what they'd done to them, and feel acknowledged by their perpetrator. So this question of acknowledgement was really important and precipitated a very significant transmission chain. For example, at the same time, all of the delegates with whom I spoke said that they'd gone to Havana as victims of one particular armed group, right? But given the interactions they'd had with the other victims there, they actually came back, in their words, as victims, collective victims of the armed conflict. So what you're getting there is a really important process of transformation that strengthens a sort of superordinate victim identity, right? But you also had a really significant moment of transformation between victims and, so kind of dyadic, if you like, victims and perpetrators, the perpetrators themselves, and between victims. And that really stems from the question of acknowledgement, right? From both sides, victims gradually acknowledging their perpetrator and vice versa. And what you get as a result of this is the gradual overcoming of in-group, out-group stereotypes. So, I mean, for example, 60 harrowing episodes of victims sitting there speaking for half an hour, however long they spoke for. One case, Raimel Barbosa, for example, who had stood on a landmine and had lost his leg, took off his prosthetic limb and smashed it down on the table and said, "This is what you've done to me. This is what you ended up forcing my life into becoming," right? And of course, those episodes, 60 of them, massively transform what had originally been a very closed-minded negotiation, right, in that regard. So you begin to see episodes of rehumanization, repersonalization, re-legitimation, shifts in the beliefs and perceptions and perspectives of the negotiating parties, but also of the victims. According to all of the people with whom I spoke, a really important result of this was the growing admission of responsibility by the negotiating parties. They started by saying, we have no responsibility over what happened. So denial of any of the violence. By the end of 2014, that changes dramatically, and into 2015, we begin to see private apologies moving towards public apologies by both the FARC, but also by the government. So really important steps towards, if you like, a kind of reparatory process. But of course, at the same time, that doesn't happen with everybody. Luis Mendieta, the gentleman in the centre of that photograph there, was a captain who was kidnapped by the FARC and held in captivity for over 11 years. He was publicly rejected by the FARC before he even went to Havana because they wouldn't accept his being categorised as a victim because he'd been in the armed forces, right? This happened to quite a few people who went to Havana, particularly when they've been victims of specific crimes, sexual and gender-based violence, state crimes, crimes against humanity, and so on. So when there wasn't any recognition from the perpetrator towards the victim, that of course caused re-traumatization and re-victimization. It was profoundly complicated. And again, happy to talk about that. But just to say, we're not talking, it wasn't a bed of roses for everybody. There were some very profound problems as well. So second aspect, before I start closing, second aspect, victims as peacemakers. Well, I guess the overall point I want to make here is if you look at the proposals, which I've done when I was sitting in this office for a very long time, very often, if you look at the proposals from the victims who went to Havana next to the final provisions of the peace agreement, they're incredibly close. Right? There's almost to the letter in many senses. Something like 167, I think, stipulations out of a total of around 500, was it?
78.
Yeah. Stipulations are directly, explicitly linked to victims' rights. I mean, that's massive, it's unprecedented, it's an enormously important peace process and peace agreement in that respect. And you get, of course, crossover with respect to demands for truth commissions, demands for a unit to investigate disappeared persons, demands from victims for prosecutions, for tribunals, diverse reparatory measures, particularly linked to socioeconomic rights. And all of those are in the agreement, right? Fundamentally important, some of them almost to the letter. So I think we shouldn't underestimate the impact of the delegations in this respect, right? What we see then in that regard is that the victims' delegations were closely able to shape demands or provisions in the final agreement related to truth, justice, and reparations. Okay, so those three elements of victims' rights. But again, of course, unsurprisingly, when the proposals made by the participants in the victims' delegations, well, they were only incorporated when they reiterated or converged with and legitimated the interests of the negotiating parties, right? So we'll include your proposals as long as they pretty much tally with what we're wanting as negotiating parties. Again, probably very unsurprising. They were excluded then, victims' demands, when they ran contrary to the economic, political, security and juridical norms and concerns that were driving the prerogatives of the negotiating parties, and particularly two elements here that are fundamental. Demands for a comprehensive land reform that didn't happen, and demands for a security sector reform, right? So for the abolition of certain elements of the military, for the overcoming of the Cold War military security doctrine and so on. None of that happened, right? So, of course, in that regard, what we see then is that the transformative capacity of the victims' delegations was constrained and subordinated to the prerogative of powerful actors. Okay. So a degree of transformation in empowerment, but also a degree of instrumentalization. And that's not surprising. I think it reiterates the challenges that elsewhere in other cases we've seen the inability or lack of will of liberal peace building to transform the structural causes of political violence, and of course to transform relations of power. So in the end, did inclusion matter? Well, I think for me, one of the key aims of this book was really to give credence to the voices of those that participated. A lot of the really good research, particularly on Nepal and Northern Ireland, that's very critical of victim inclusion mechanisms, seems to be written from libraries rather than actually really engaging and listening to the folks that have experienced these processes. So, of course, we're talking about 60 out of 9 million, and we can come to that question in a moment, which is problematic. But I wanted to tell the story from the perspective of the victims' delegations themselves, right? And what I think we see is, on the one hand, there was important empowerment with respect to transformative dynamics with dyadic groups, with respect to health issues, with respect to mental health issues, with respect to being able to shape some of the content of the peace agreement. But of course, there are limits there as well, right? But what I wanted to do was not to prioritize the experience of instrumentalization that other scholars have done elsewhere over other more transformative occurrences, if you like, of kind of bottom-up empowerment, dignification, acknowledgement, and restoration. It's actually narrated by the participants themselves. So in that regard, I guess the book is about how the delegations represented a kind of space for encounter and the affirmation of political subjectivity, right? So what I do then in that respect is I propose a spectrum, an empowerment instrumentalization spectrum, right? And what I say is actually, in order to overcome a kind of binary Manichaean reading of it's either instrumentalization or it's empowerment, we can actually see it as a spectrum. And it's multidimensional, and we see very often nuanced, overlapping forms and expressions of empowerment and instrumentalization. And very often, these phenomena might be experienced by individuals or by collective groups at the same time and in diverse fields. So that, in a sense, is kind of the key sort of contribution to some of the theory. I've probably massacred it, but I go into that in a lot of detail in the book. And of course, the point to make here is that the capacity of victims to assert agency is not going to be an isolated phenomenon at all. It's contingent upon the parameters of the institutional framework of the peace process in this respect, and emphatically whether this permits the reallocation or the redistribution and recalibration of power. So, final point I wanted to make is to come back to this idea of whether or not inclusion is really able to make post-accord settlements more stable and more resilient. I think that's probably the most problematic aspect of the entire academic scholarship on this is this sort of rather benign idea that if you include victims in peace negotiations, you're going to end up with a far more stable peace process. I know, Josefina, you and I have spoken about this, but I'm still trying to weigh up. And if you look at the case of Colombia, simply you have in the aftermath of what was a very important peace process, you have a plebiscite really at the end of the process to see whether or not Colombian society would ratify the peace agreements. Of course they don't, right? And it's renegotiated very rapidly and then sort of passed under the table and approved. But I guess the point is I'm very skeptical of the capacity of victim inclusion actually to be able to foster wider appropriation of accountability mechanisms or peace agreements. You know, clearly there's really great work. Madhav, you've done brilliant work on this, you know, with respect to recidivism and what the factors of recidivism are, economy, DDR, and all these big processes. I'm not sure that inclusion is able really to mitigate those kind of issues. Doesn't mean that it doesn't play a role, but that would be a sort of a skeptical note to end on, I guess. So that's all I wanted to say. Really looking forward to hearing questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Roy. I wouldn't have expected anything different than to end on some skeptical note. Not just from you, but on this day. So, but I think it's a skeptical note that comes from a lot of careful work and not, you know, sarcasm or anything similar. I have now the honor of inviting our first discussant, Patrick McQuestion, who's doing his PhD in political science and peace studies here at the University of Notre Dame. He has a master's in development management and policy from Georgetown University, also in conjunction with Universidad Nacional de San Martín in Argentina. Before he started his PhD work, he was one of the research associates at the Kroc Institute's Peace Accords Matrix, and he contributed greatly to research and data management in compliance precisely with monitoring the implementation of the 2016 Colombian Peace Accord. He has already published policy briefs and reports related to Colombia, to peace accords and public policy. And so it is really, I'm really looking forward to hear Patrick's comments and questions in the next 10 to 12 minutes, if you please. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you, Josefina. Thanks, Roddy. Thanks everyone for being here. I really enjoyed, I was able to access the book and really enjoyed reading it. I'd really recommend it to anyone who's interested in the nitty-gritty. I think it does a fabulous job of describing this process I mean, obviously you provide context, historical context of the conflict in Colombia, which takes a lot of work to do, a lot of choices and decisions I'm sure you had to make about how to frame that. And it was effective in the sense that it was able to contextualize how these delegations emerged. And so I commend you, and I think that it provides a lot of contributions to understanding victim inclusion generally in the negotiation phase, but also in the design, the actual physical design of peace agreements, the literal design of them, and how transitional justice processes are shaped by this. I think one area that I think would be really fascinating to understand would be how the transitional justice processes, once they begin, how are they being shaped by victims at all? You know, not necessarily delegations. It could be expanded to include other types, other groups of victims, but that would be interesting to sort of follow. I mean, you sort of suggest these kinds of research questions in your book. The richness again of the data that you have, the interviews that you made really do lead to these kinds of cutting edge research questions. So I read the book in a way that I don't want to sort of repeat what you said, so I want to just offer sort of my interpretation of the book. The research question that I identified, one of the central ones was, what might an effective victim-centered transitional justice process look like, and what might realistically be expected from it? And I think sort of resonating with your skeptical tone at the end, I think it's also included in these kinds of questions. The subtitle of the book is, so the book title is Victim-Centered Peacemaking. The subtitle is Colombia's Santos-FARC-EP peace process. So even the subtitle hints at this sort of elite level process. The chapter titles include questions themselves. So it's not that you've come to some sort of conclusion, and you do raise these sort of skeptical questions. And I really do think that the instrumental empowerment spectrum that you introduce is just so fabulous at drawing out these sort of tensions. So I think another question that I had would be sort of the generalizability of that spectrum. Is there something that you, some other process in the peace accord in Colombia or some other case of peace building where this spectrum could be used? So the generalizability of that, we can come back to that if you want, but I think it was really helpful in unpacking these tensions at multiple levels. You had the individual level, you had the national level, and you also had these collective levels of tension. And I was also fascinated by the ideational shift, I would call it, that you tease out in your history of the conflict, and particularly in the last couple decades after the Cold War. I would say you mentioned sort of the Cold War era, but the post-Cold War era, the ideational shifts from neoliberal and liberal peace to inclusivity and bottom-up processes. You look at transitional justice from regime level transitions, so from autocracies, which you mentioned some of the literature on that, a shift from that kind of transitional justice to the post-conflict or war to peace transitions. And then victims as passive or categorically defined to victims as multidimensional, as relational, as instrumental for sustainable peace. They're active agents that are also gaining identity in these processes. So I thought that was really interesting. Your methods, center on these 70 interviews that you gather. Really fascinating because it's not just victims. You're also talking to government representatives, international and national organizers behind the delegation. So one aspect of this, and I don't know if you mentioned it in your presentation of the delegation process, is that there were 3 sort of central organizations helping to organize and coordinate this effort, right? It was the UN, I don't know exactly what office.
The special representative.
Special representative from the UN, National University of Colombia, and then the ecclesiastical Catholic Church, So those 3 came together, international, national organizations coming together to provide legitimacy, organizational capacity to a very ambitious process and a contentious one. So moving from the historical context, you get into the nitty-gritty of the selection criteria and process in the book. And I really commend you for that because it's a lot of moving parts. You mentioned the public forums that they had to organize that gathered hundreds, if not hundreds of thousands of victims in the process. They also opened an electronic portal to collect proposals, over 9,000 proposals for the negotiating table. So there was a lot going on in the background, and the delegations were sort of a culmination or tangible result of this organizational work. So the book really digs into that, and I thought that was fascinating. But as you mentioned, the analytical core of the book is this instrumentalization empowerment spectrum. And so you mentioned the ideational shifts in the perpetrators occurring within a few of these episodes, legitimation of the peace process itself occurring, the complex relational dynamics through moral engagement that emerge from the context itself. And you mentioned not just the presentations, but also the coffee breaks, these sort of informal sessions where victims are able to raise concerns and to transform the moral sort of playing ground or the moral engagement that they have with their perpetrators. So I thought that was really poignant in the examples. I do think your skepticism comes out as well in these case studies, in the power holders, and how in order for victims to mold the sphere of peacemaking. You write here, pragmatic and political legitimacy for states and international actors will be contingent upon their strategic capacity to withstand and shape wider structures and relations of power. However, it will also be dependent on whether, and if so, to what extent, formal mechanisms themselves are susceptible to the reallocation and redefinition of relationships of power, including across and between genders and between dyadic groups, such as victims and perpetrators. You do, I think, a fabulous job in this book of breaking down those categories, victims, perpetrators. This is the kind of context in which these transformations take place. Identities, but also interrelation at the same time. So I guess, yeah, the three questions I had were related to the generalizability of this spectrum. It may only apply to cases where victimization has occurred, or maybe not. Maybe it can apply to places where it's not necessarily a violent conflict occurring. The spectrum can help us observe these transformative interactions. Another question was related to organizations. So one of the recommendations, the book concludes with some really fascinating policy recommendations based on really great empirical data. So one of the recommendations is to include organizations, to be more inclusive of these organizations because of their capacity to organize and to, I guess, aggregate demands in certain ways. So it also acknowledges, however, that organizations can be led by a small group of experts. There's a tension in organizations, but how would they most effectively be incorporated into these processes? You sort of hint at it, but I would be curious to hear of cases where organizations were effective in doing that. And then a third minor point that you mentioned at the beginning is your own positionality as an international UN investigator. I thought that was really appropriate and really poignant at the moment that you mentioned it, because you were contracted by the UN to investigate this process, which is fascinating. So how would this research have looked if it was carried out by some other investigator or some other organization? Could you sort of hint at, or did you get a sense of how people were responding to you in a different way? So those are just some questions for me.
Thank you.
Thanks, Roddy.
Thank you very
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful to hear and to invite us to think beyond the Colombian case. Now I have the pleasure to invite Alison Rivera Meneses, who is, I said before, a professor of Hispanic Studies at Warwick University, also in the UK, where she's also the deputy chair of the Faculty of Arts, responsible for research. Her research interests lie in literature and film, and in the relationship between history, memory, and culture in the Hispanic world. So I'm very curious to hear your comments about this book from your own disciplinary and regional expertise. So thank you very much, Alison, and I hope you can share with us for around 10 to 12 minutes. Thank you.
Sure, thank you very much. I think this is the first chance I've had publicly to thank the Kroc Institute and Professor Asher Kaufman for hosting me this year, also positing that. So thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. Roddy, congratulations. Thank you so much for inviting me to read the book in advance and to learn, which is what I have been doing a great deal coming from outside peace studies, but working on issues of memory, so there's a lot of questions that are quite similar. I think it was absolutely fascinating, Roddy, to hear and see that privileged access and how it played out through the book, because I don't know how many people have had the opportunity to get quite so close to the process as it happened. So that is amazing. And I think to start off and say that your survey of Colombian history is wonderful. So if anybody wants to understand Colombian history, which is really complex in the 20th century, and how we got to where we are, and you've only got an afternoon, Roddy's early chapters are for you. When you say that Colombia's, and I think this is more or less a quote, Colombia's chronicles of grotesque violence are equaled by its innovative peace building. That is what has always struck me as an outsider about Colombia. It's an enormous paradox, but it also is where in many ways, the hope that you spoke about earlier comes from. I don't need to rehearse, because Patrick, I knew you would do such a great job. So to stick on things that come from my angle. I don't need to rehearse what the book proposes in terms of this tension between instrumentalization and victim empowerment and agency. I was really interested, though, in this focus on the question of victims and on the question of interviews. You mentioned very briefly your methodology coming out of grounded theory. Now, I'm not a sociologist, but I've done a bit of Googling. And the way you presented and use it seems to me to balance very nicely that question of inclusion and analysis, which is something that I think we all struggle with when we're trying to work with interview data, with living human beings and their diverse experiences. And it's something, if I can bring in another book, the companion to Peace and Conflict Fieldwork that you've edited, there's a phrase in there, thinking with others and through the material, which I think is actually what you're doing, and that's totally appropriate to the topic of the book. So I found that absolutely convincing, that idea of inclusion. And you mentioned dignification, which I think is a fundamental process here. So the methodology, it seems to me, fits with what you're trying to do. And like all good books, I'm reading and enjoying and learning. I was also starting to think and ask questions, because I think the best books are the ones that make us start to think. So this question of victims and their agency, their ability to, what you say is reconstitute a moral community, I think is where I, perhaps selfishly, because of my own research, focused in. I love the idea that these delegations were disruptive. I'd love to hear a little bit more about using that. Yeah. But the three areas of questions that came to mind, I have no idea of time, Sophia, but I'll just set that.
Yeah,
I won't be too long.
No worry. I have like 8 minutes.
We won't need that. It was a question of working with the interviewees. I just have questions about access, which you've already raised, that Patrick raised the question of the UN role, and I was wondering to what extent that enabled and inhibited the conversations. I know there are questions of confidentiality, so respect that. But that researcher-participant relationship is something that people talk a great deal about, and in interviews, the sort of the performativity of being a victim, which Roxanne Cristalli has talked about in her work recently. What constitutes a good victim? Yeah. Not critically, but that process of becoming what will be effective. So I was really interested to sort of hear more, if you can tell us about the dynamics of that. And I was thinking about that dynamics both in Havana, but also if there was a form, and this is the second question, of kind of political learning or victim building learning between the delegations, because presumably they're not isolated groups. They went, as you said, over 5 minutes. So the question here, in terms, if you like, the learning how to do peace from their point of view, I was interested to know how they use strategies they already knew as activists.
The delegates.
Yeah, the delegates. I'm thinking of the delegates. So I'm focusing in on those. So how they use strategies they already knew, perhaps, and perhaps had to adapt them. And I know this is your focus. This might be a further set of work from the interviews. But did they talk about adapting those strategies? Obviously, you talk about them as a collective, so there's a transformational element within that, and I'm just curious to know how that might have worked. But I was also wondering if they are conscious of being the second, the third, or the fourth delegation, and whether they're learning from the previous delegation, what those dynamics are between the delegations. So there's a question of, and this kind of comes out the other end, and it's beyond the end of the book. So this is just curiosity. I don't know if you have any sense that beyond the sort of slight skepticism, in formal terms, what the impact of this way of including victims has been on the ground. And the reason I ask is just happened last week to be at a conference in London where there was a paper on people working with a group that had been part of the Nodo for exile in London. And they were talking about the follow-on activities and the agency that it had given those people afterwards.
Yeah.
So there's a sense that the formal process is a limitation, but actually the informal dimensions of that, I don't know how far they peter out or not. Maybe that's wishful thinking on my part. I don't know. So I was curious about that. And then the last question I had, in a sense, was, and I was thinking about the Commission de la Verdad's approach of contrast. So there's not a truth, but we're taking perspectives and contrasting literally, or thinking about them. And that made me wonder what other materials outside the interviews these delegates might have released. Have they written memoirs? Have they written articles? Have they commented, reflecting later? So what even those follow-up interviews to think about what they say about Havana and what maybe they think about it or reflect on it several years down the line. Which is perhaps unfair because I accept some of these are not what you set out to do. It's what I started to think about in terms of victim agency, how that might play out.
Yeah.
But thank you for the invitation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We also follow a lot of that in when we monitor the implementation, and so thank you so much for those comments that of course follow a little bit beyond the limits of the particular research, but that for us to engage in conversation, I think can be extremely interesting. Roddy, this is your time, so to speak. So I wonder if you would like to maybe respond quickly to both Patrick and Alison, and then we open the round.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Perfect.
All
Yes,
right.
yes.
Please go ahead.
No, first of all, thanks so much for reading really. That's 1 to 4 of us who've read it. That's it's a win, right? Thank you very much. I mean, really carefully reading, really thoughtful responses. So I'll just respond briefly. So I'm going to start with the positionality question. Yeah, it was really complicated because, I mean, essentially there were things I just was not allowed to say, right? In terms of principally criticizing the UN from the very beginning. The idea was this goes out, you publish it in a UN. But this is what's the word? Chatham House rules. So what this isn't public. What I'm going to say.
Yeah,
Sure.
sure. I mean, you mean among ourselves. I'm like, it's too late for that. I gotta book, but among ourselves.
What I'm going to say now, yeah.
Yes.
So yeah, no, from the very beginning it was complicated what I wasn't and wasn't allowed to ask or to say. Everything that was, all of the questions were vetted, right? From the very beginning were vetted. They were sent to my colleagues at the UN, and they were approved or not. I think I even do I include the research, the interview questions in the back of the book?
Yeah.
They were approved by the UN system, but actually in the end they were fairly open, and gradually as it became clear that I wasn't going to do a dirty on them, right? And actually I was going to be fair and critical, but also positive. The ability to criticize was, they kind of handed it over and they let me do it. So in a way I wasn't that constrained, right? Obviously this is different because this is now public, it's out there. I was basically given copyright over the material. So the UN hasn't seen this. I don't know what they'll say when they see it. I think it's quite a fair analysis. There are other scholars two other scholars who've worked on the victims delegations. Mendes, I think she's called Mendes. She's really good.
Julia, no.
No, I can dig it out. But her analysis is fairly similar to mine, I think. Mendes. Yeah, Mendes. Victims as protagonists in transitional justice. I think her analysis is pretty similar to mine in the end. It was a research project that she carried out, without UN backing or didn't have that level of access. But, I think in the end, there were two ways to do this, right? It would have been following the line of people like Kieran McAvoy or Simon Robbins, and I really like Simon Robbins' work, which would be just a very strong critique. This is all instrumentalization. Nothing else happens in these contexts. Victims are used to rubber stamp the process. And I think the cases that Robbins works on, I think he's probably right. But that felt to me that it was not the case in the Colombian context, hence the spectrum, if you like. And also the fact is, you've got to do justice to these people's immensely brave decision to sit in front of their perpetrator, as they constantly called it, mi victimario, to sit in front of their perpetrator and look them in the eye and tell them what had happened. There was a lot going on every time, every single person. So the process was, and this comes back to some of the other questions, right? The process was the UN, different UN organizations, the Catholic Church, National University, with the support of wider victims organizations, drew up a list of a couple of thousand people. And from that list, they gradually kind of whittled it down. And then they would phone somebody up and say, right, you've been chosen to go on number 1 victim delegation or number 2 victim delegation. Do you want to go? We'll give you a day to think about it. You're not allowed to tell anybody. Of course, nobody didn't say anything. Everybody went out and spoke with their organizations and their families and so on and so forth. And so, that was the question of bringing organizations in from the beginning was really important, right? And as you say, it's a recommendation in the book. It needs to happen. It didn't happen early enough. And essentially, it was a very elite group of people making those decisions with consultancy with wider victims organizations. But, it should have they should have been brought in from the very beginning in a far more protagonistic manner, right? And that was refused. Because in a sense, you can understand it, because victims organizations in Colombia, as they are in many other countries, are very politicized and polarized. Right? So there was a lot of watching your own back as the UN or as the organizing committee. So the positionality question, I guess I've spoken a bit about the inclusion of organization, the generalizability issue. I mean, I think this, I'm not sure I'm proposing it as generalizable, but I suspect it might travel in terms of the fact that all I guess I'm saying is that we need to be far less kind of binary when it comes to looking at whether or not inclusion means anything. 1, 2, in a sense, it's a more sort of decolonizing perspective and saying you have to listen to the people who are engaged, who are involving, and who are participating in the process, and not just write it from an office in Bristol, for example. And so I think that that's not very controversial, right? I think there's a massive turn in peace and conflict studies over the last decade or so that really pushes us towards engaging with conflict-affected populations and individuals in a meaningful manner that isn't extractive research, but rather is really kind of driven by people on the ground. So I don't think that's necessarily controversial, but I do think, it's worth thinking about a spectrum when it comes to understanding participation in peace processes, participation in the design of transitional justice mechanisms. So, I suspect there might be something there. I'd be happy to hear your comments further on that. I think it's a really interesting question. So coming back, Alison, thanks very much again to you as well as to Patrick. So I didn't know it was grounded theory. I didn't know that's what I was doing. Yeah, no, I know what I'm saying. So basically, I am very old school when it comes to, I'm trained as an anthropologist, right? So go out, do your interviews, or your field work, or your ethnography, come back, write it up, write your journals, begin to think about it, transcribe everything, you've got all your sections, and then just move bits around and build up the chapters. And then, so obviously I was talking to colleagues and they said, oh, you're using grounded theory, Roddy. to do your analysis, which was massive news to me, but I'm glad that it's in there because obviously you need that sort of thing. But you know, I like the idea of the fact that that was sort of relevant for the fact that it was that the book is about inclusion, right? That actually you can't write this sort of stuff really without having a very close collaboration. And I think the collaborations, carrying out the interviews, I mean, I'm fairly seasoned when it comes to that. I mean, I spent sort of 3 years or so living in post-genocide communities in Guatemala, carrying out interviews that were used for a legal trial against Rios Montt, against Guatemala's former dictator. And then I also developed a book out of that. And, you know, that was 20 years ago, pretty much. So it's something that I've been doing for a long time. Nevertheless, I think I found it really disturbing and really, really difficult. I'd already been living in Colombia for about 3 years. No, for 5 years. I've been living in Colombia for 5 years. Went away, went to University of St Andrews, was working there for Tony. Got to get that in there. And then went back to carry out this research on a research leave, a year's research leave, and it was really troubling. I think, you know, so what was very important, and I mentioned in the book, is the fact that the victims themselves have really important access to a counsellor and to a therapist during the delegations themselves, but nothing afterwards. And in a sense, I didn't talk about this in the presentation, but you know, the problem is what we see in the context is participation was perceived of as taking place during 5 months, and then the UN and everybody else will wash their hands. That, in a sense, is kind of the harshest and I think most relevant critique of the UN's behaviour, because effectively people were left on their own afterwards, right? And what happened was people would coming back to your reconstitution of a moral community question. People would come back after having spent a week or so with members of their delegation, would go back into their communities, and they'd go back into communities that really didn't want to talk about peace, wanted to talk about war, right? And so in that respect, at least 25 of the people that went to Havana came back and were displaced because of death threats. 40% received death threats, 25 of them actually ended up having to move on some occasions twice. So they were displaced 3 times, right? One individual, his daughter was murdered after he'd come back from Havana. So again, in terms of the policy question, of the critiques, you know, the issue was security. You could have seen that a mile away, right? But they really didn't provide resources for what happened in the aftermath of this very episodic, momentary participation event. And I think that was, you know, that was deeply, deeply disturbing. And again, it was something that I raised with the UN themselves. I think the problem was they did it all on the fly, right? It all just happened really quickly. They hadn't really been given time by the negotiating parties to think about it. So it all happened very quickly, but these were the sort of things you could have seen. Why not?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Roddy. We are, you know, it's also a lot of these lessons learned also travel to processes that are, you know, like Truth Commission that we also saw, and we have here at the University of Notre Dame, a few of the staff that have come in seeking not just physical security refuge, but also further mental support. And it ends with the end of the mandate. So I think we still gotta learn from that, unfortunately.